Moving on, we're going to be going into the Infill tab next. And the infill, like I said before, is the volume inside a print. And it's usually associated by saying exactly how much plastic is on the inside, what percentage. Very often you don't need a 3D printed object to be completely 100% solid, because that would be a waste of time and a waste of plastic, and it generally just doesn't need to be that strong. So we can say exactly what is the percentage of plastic on the inside, and then the rest of it will just be air. So for this benchy that I have here, I have it set to 8% infill density. The infill density is basically saying that of my part on the inside, where I actually need to have a gap, then all of these curves, all this structure on the inside, this is only 8% of the inner volume. If I increase this to something like 20%, then you'll see that I have significantly higher amounts of material in there. And all of my infill material is significantly more dense in here. Now the little curved patterns that you're seeing here, this is known as a infill pattern called gyroid. Now gyroid is a relatively new mathematical shape. It is basically just a bunch of sine waves that then move in different directions and they will merge back and forth. It doesn't really have a ton of use outside of the world of 3D printing, but in the world of 3D printing, it is very, very clever. It's a structure where if you apply a force in any direction, the force kind of gets distributed, and so it makes a very, very strong part in all different areas. Not only does it look really cool, but it is a very, very strong and very, very quick print. Going back to the infill density, 20% is pretty high. I usually max out at about 15% infill and go as low as about 8%. I find within that range is just fine. But you'll also notice that I have infill line distance, and that's going to be the distance in between the two sections of our infill. And this kind of leads us into an area known as bridging, where if you have two solid supports and your printhead wants to move in between it, then we have a bridging. And very often this is a tricky part for 3D printers, because when it's printing in midair, just with gravity and the molten plastic, it wants to droop quite a lot. And so you can mess around with some of the temperatures and speeds to try and limit all of that warping. But generally, if you have a bridge that's 5mm or less, you are totally fine. You don't need to worry about anything. It's when you have larger stretches than 5mm. So when I'm setting my absolute minimum infill density, you can just check it by typing in 5mm, because that's the furthest gap I want to be, and it'll say, okay, that's perfect, and it is about 8% infill density. Going down to the infill pattern though, we've got a really long list of things that we can mess around with. A lot of these just look really cool, and they aren't any stronger than gyroid. Maybe they print a little bit faster, but they can have really cool effects when you're actually printing it. But what I've found is that I only really need to mess around with two different types of infill. Either I'm messing around with gyroid if I want a really strong part in all different areas, or I can pick grid. Now grid is purely just a top-down grid structure. It isn't very exciting, but it is very strong. But it's only strong in one direction. If you know your force is going to be compressive and it is only ever going to be going down in one direction, then this is a really fast and really strong infill. If you were making something like the, let's say if you need to replace the leg of a cabinet and you need to have a 3D printed part and you know the only force is going to be pushing down on it, then a grid infill is a really good idea. But most of the time I just stick with gyroid. It's my favorite infill to do. Moving onwards, we can go into the material portion, and the material is generally always associated with the filament that you're working with. How hot does it need to go? What is the flow associated with it? And what is the build temperature that it likes to be? Just like with all 3D printing, you've got two different temperature values. You've got the hot end and you've got the bed. When you're working with the printing temperature, which is the nozzle, I like to mess around with these three different settings. The printing temperature, which is how hot is the nozzle during the rest of the print. what is the initial layer, what is the temperature of the very, very first layer that it's throwing down, and what is the temperature of the very, very last layer. And as I'm going through this, I've got 205 degrees Celsius, which I find is a perfectly normal setting for almost all of my PLA that I work with. Generally, if you've got a really shiny material, something like silk gold or silk silver or copper or something like that, the material is just a little bit more slick, and so you need to have a hotter nozzle so it meets less resistance as the extruder is pushing it through. For the very, very first layer, the initial, I like to have a hotter temperature just because I want my filament to be a little bit more liquidy and kind of ooze into the grit of the bed a little bit more. And then for the final printing temperature, I want it to be ever so slightly colder, and this will give me less stringing on the very, very top surface. For the build plate temperature, I generally always leave it about 60 degrees Celsius. When you're talking about 3D printing with PLA, technically you don't need any heated build plate, but it is much, much nicer. In the 3D printing, if you start to print and you first layer if you're noticing that it's lifting and warping a little bit in certain sections, that's a good sign that you've got too much of a delta, too much of a difference between how hot the plastic is when it's being extruded and how hot is it on the bed. If that delta is too large, if you're printing a really hot temperature and then it's going onto a cold build plate, it's cooling too quickly, it can actually start to curl up and retract very, very easily. But if you print at kind of a medium temperature and it's going onto a nice hot bed, then it means it's not going to be contracting too much. It's going to stay in that kind of semi-liquid, semi-solid state. As far as the flow, this is something that I don't touch all that often. If I'm printing a flexible material like TPU, which is what a lot of phone cases are printed out of, then I want to increase my flow because I've got so much, well, I've got a flexible material and it doesn't really want to move in a straight line. It wants to kind of bulge out either end. But for the top surface, I have said, hey, print a little bit more, just so on the very top I don't have any gaps in any of my prints. Moving on to speed. As the name implies, the speed is all of the different speeds that you can associate with the different features of your print. And there's a lot of different sections of your print, and we can actually check it out. So if you slice your object and then view it in a different color scheme, so currently I have it set as the material color, so everything that's printed is this kind of slightly ugly yellow. But we can change the different colors. So if we say, hey, the line type, associate a different color with all of the different features of our print, then we can take a look at it. So the outer skin is going to be all red. This top surface or bottom surface is going to be yellow. The inner wall is going to be green, and the infill is going to be orange. And we also have these little white sections over here, which is where is the nozzle stopping, moving up to a new layer, and then continuing onwards. That's our Z seam right there. And I'm able to kind of see all of the different features on it. And as far as the speed, or as far as all of the settings for the speed, I'm really setting it into two different categories. For the print, am I going to see it, or is it kind of locked inside the print? If I know I'm going to be looking at it, like the outer surface, this red portion, which would be the outer wall, then I know I want it to print really, really slow. I have it set to 35 millimeters per second, which is a pretty good starting value. And then everything else, I want it to print really, really quickly because I'm never going to see it. Generally, things that print really quickly don't look all that good because they're speeding up and slowing down, accelerating, decelerating, and it ends up putting in very, very small vibrations into your print. But when it's printing really slow, it's nice and relaxed. The processor isn't doing all that much work, and so it can be very calculated and very efficient. So for things like your printer speed, the infill, the inner wall speed, everything like that, printing really fast at 90 millimeters per second. When I'm moving my cursor over here, all of the little pop-ups in the black screen, this is what that settings guide is we talked about earlier in the marketplace. This is a really, really easy thing to put into. Some of the other sections that I have, like the bottom speed or the initial layer, I want it to print really, really slowly at 15 millimeters per second. This is another really good section about 3D printing, where if you slow things down, things just tend to work a lot nicer. So for the very first layer, currently I've set a higher width, which means it's putting out more volume. I've put a thicker layer, which means it's going to be staying hotter for a longer amount of time. I've increased the temperature for the first layer so it can ooze a little bit more and grab into the grit of the build plate, and I've also slowed it down so there's less force trying to tug at it and kind of pull it off the bed. So all of these values are going to make the likelihood of a good first layer going down much higher. As far as the travel speed over here, this is how fast is our nozzle moving when it's not actually printing. So if you've got multiple parts on a build plate, how fast is it moving? I have maxed this out to 200 millimeters per second. Go as fast as you can, because the slower that you go, the more time you have for gravity to pull all of your material, which actually just oozes onto your bed, and it can give you a really, really bad quality known as stringing, which is something we're going to try to avoid as much as possible. I've also said a couple slow layers. So if I have the very first layer printing kind of slow, then it means the next layer is going to be printing a little bit faster, but still pretty slow. And that gives me a pretty good amount of time just to make sure that everything that I'm printing is really locked down in place. And then everything after that, it can print much faster because I know that it's going to stick in the bed really, really well.